Good evening. My name is Jaishree Chouhan. I am a junior research fellow at the Department of English, University of Rajasthan. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of tribal history and tribal representation in history in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review, Summer 2023. In collaboration with Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria, we're also calling for submission of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelist, Professor Joy Pachuau, Mr. Tuhin A. Sinha, Ms. Richa Lakhera, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is tribal representation in historical narratives and mainstream content under the sub-theme historicity of social and political struggles of tribal communities. Today's discussion will be tracing back the underrepresentation of tribal communities in mainstream conversations and content consumptions. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Professor Joy L.K. Pachuau. Dr. Joy is Professor of History at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India, where she teaches medieval Indian history. Her research interests include the history of women and gender relation in medieval India, the history of Portuguese expansion in India, in Asia, especially in relation to religion, but also other socio-cultural aspects, and the history of Northeast India with the focus in history of identity formations. Professor Pachau's major publications include Entangled Lives, Human, Plant, Animal Histories of Eastern Himalayan Triangle, published in 2022, Being Mizo, Identity and Belonging in Northeast India, published in 2014, The Camera as Witness, Social History of Mizoram, Northeast India, published in 2015. Being Mizo won the Sneh Mahajan Prize for Best Book in Modern Indian History, awarded by Indian History Congress. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Professor Joy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our second speaker for the session is Mr. Tuhin A. Sinha. Tuhin A. Sinha is a best-selling author, columnist, and politician. He is acknowledged among most prolific Indian writers with the maverick knack to experiment with new genres. His recent releases include geopolitical thriller Mission Shenanigans and the first two books of his trilogy around India's unsung subaltern heroes, The Legend of Birsa Munda and The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat. Tuhin was written extensively on political issues through his articles on India Today, First Post, and Print, among others. So he is a popular media voice of the BJP and represents the party on primetime news debates. We are delighted to have you, sir, on this panel. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our third panel for the session is Ms. Richa Lakhera. Richa Lakhera is an award-winning TV journalist, screenwriter, and author of 6 novels. Her body of work includes novels like Contamination, Hungry Gods, Item Girl, Garbage Beat. Her next novel is History of Violence. Her novels encompasses myriad cultural subsets in multiple genres, have been adapted in Hindi, and several titles have been picked for film adaptation and OTT. She has worked as deputy editor and senior correspondent at NDTV India, NDTV 24/7 India for over a decade. She is a recipient of excellence in entertainment journalism award from the Indian Council of UN Relations in 2016, and the recipient of 1000 Women of Excellence in Asia Women Innovator Award in 2021. Richa is a trained fine artist, conceptualized online art gallery, makeover. We are delighted to have you on this panel, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Professor Joy to share her insights. Over to you, ma'am.
Great. Thank you very much, Jaishree, for this opportunity to be part of this discussion. And I also want to greet Mr. Tuhin Sinha and Richa Lakhera as well, who are also part of this panel. So thank you very much for having me here. Now, as you know, I'm from the Northeast, and I have essentially been working on the Mizos from the state. I mean, the state of generally around Mizoram and the surrounding areas, but I've also been working on Northeast India. And as we all know, Northeast India has many tribal communities, ethnic communities. I mean, the word tribal is used by our constitution, so we cannot get away from this particular term. Although I must state here that similar communities in the region, in areas outside of India, do not use the word tribal for various reasons. So anyway, we are stuck with the word tribal. And in any case, I want to start off by saying that uh, the when we talk about tribal histories in Northeast India, we sort of have to take the entire region into consideration. So it's more in terms of talking about the history of Northeast India rather than particular histories of communities as such. Okay, so if we talk about the histories of the communities in Northeast India, as we all know, I'm a historian, so I'll talk about a little bit about that. The writing of the history of the Northeast, as you know, was essentially begun by colonial administrators and ethnographers. So whether it was for the Nagas, whether it was for the Mizos, whether it was for Assam or even the tribes of, I mean, not just the tribes, but the communities of Manipur and Tripura, a sort of formal writing of the history of the region began with these ethnographers. And their work, as you know, was in the nature of ethnography, which also would have introduced aspects of society and culture, aspects of history, and how the people understood their histories as well. So that's the beginning of a modern sort of representation of the region. But of course, we have to recognize that these ethnographies, although they are very useful for us today, came with a lot of problems as well. And one of the main problems in the writing of of this region by colonial ethnographers was in a way creating or homogenizing various groups of people. Like, for instance, if you talk about the Lushai Hills, which used to be a conglomeration of several communities and tribes, the belief the when you write to a certain extent, you cannot get into very many particularities. So there is an attempt at homogenizing, and along with other kind of historical, no, sorry, colonial administrative policies, you begin to homogenize particular territories. So I think one of the sort of effects which can be considered good in some ways, but at another level, what happens as a result of this writing is the homogenization of identities. So that is one thing that I wanted to talk about. The second thing is that because these writings were linked to colonial administration, the anthropological works or historical works of the region was very much linked to the status enterprise of trying to colonize the region. So they were written not just in order to know the histories of the people, but in order to see how best these groups of peoples could be brought under colonial administration, how they could be sort of governed. So historical writing, in a way, served a particular purpose, which was for the community as a whole. Which which served the purpose of colonial administration. So and this had a great impact on identity and the development of the identity of the people of the region as well. So that is in the colonial period that I wanted to sort of briefly highlight. And since we don't have time, I'm just going to quickly gloss over some of the concerns of history, right? So, if you think of the region in post-colonial period, uh, not much has been written in the post-colonial uh, period. Um, and except I will say that of there have been works that have come out from the region. So one of the things about the Northeast is that from very early on, the people of the region themselves started writing about themselves. And if I may say so, like for instance, in the case of the Mizos, the people of the region attempted at writing their own histories, and these histories generally sort of at one level they were very much interested in their origins. So origin stories, folk narratives of how the people originated became an important component of this of the writing of their own history. So when the Mizos started writing about their histories, it wasn't so much it did not really distinguish or between, say, factual history and mythological history. So there was some kind of going back to mythological histories and trying to understand who we are as people through these mythological writings. But what I want to stress here is that definitely there was a great interest in the writing of histories of the people from within the region, not so much from outside the region. Okay, and it's only in much more recent times, and that in history works, the writing of people have they significantly in contemporary sort of situation, we find that the people are being written about not just by outsiders, but also by the people of the region themselves. Okay, so a lot can be said about the kind of histories that are coming out from the region now, but I shall leave it at that. So that is the broad sort of framework through which historical narratives from the region have come about. The other thing is that uh, one of the so while at one level the people of the region are trying to engage with the writing of their own histories, I also want to say that there is a constant narrative about uh, uh, what the region is about from outside of the region. So, for instance, just like in colonial times, there were these colonial administrator ethnographers trying to write about the region. The region has also been seen from, if I may use the word, mainland India, and this narrative has had, and this since the post-independence period, the narrative has sort of I wouldn't say change, but it has gone in particular ways. And so, in terms of history writing, not much has been written about the region from mainland sort of India, and I think that. I just wanted to point to two things. I don't know how much time I have, but I just wanted to point out to two things that, especially in things uh, uh, like in things like uh, uh, in the cultural sense, the region is being presented in certain ways. And actually, in my book, Being Mizo, I talk about how the Northeast is being constructed as an other for the rest of India. For those of us who are working in history literature, we have ideas of Orientalism, and in similar about how the West constructs the Orient. And so, in the book, I argue that there is an othering with regard to the Northeast that has taken place since the time of independence, and it sort of continues. And we can see that through films. For instance, in 1970s, there was a film called Ye Gulistan Hamara, which was directed by Atma Ram with Dev Anand. And Dev Anand is an engineer who goes and works in the region. And so the region is presented as this tribal, and tribal is something that is the imagination of people. So the name of the community is not mentioned. So very often the region is seen as one broad. It's given. It's how shall I put it? There's one through broad strokes. We are trying to understand the region, and the particularities of the region do not come out. Specificities of the region do not come out, and there is this sort of imagined tribal that exists in the region. And of course, Devanand represents this colonial, the state that is trying to bring in development into the region. And the film also, works in terms of binaries a lot. So, tribal versus civilized, plain versus hills, uh, development versus anti-development. So it works in those tropes and tries to represent the region in that sense. And similarly, I think in films like in Chapu, which is a more recent film which others would have seen, where there are, there's a perfunctory presence of two Northeast people, and throughout the film, they are there as part of the Indian national team, the hockey team, but there is like they are made to speak like two or three lines throughout the movie. Present, but they're not allowed to speak in that sense. So I think in a way, so that is again another kind of representation of the Northeast that we see in films. And I think a student the other day was commenting on the film Anek also, which we all know, a much more recent film, and it's situated in Nagaland, if I'm not mistaken. And he said that the films like Anek try to dismantle stereotypes of the Northeast, but in doing so, it reifies the stereotypes themselves. Okay, so I think in terms of representation of tribals in the Northeast, that one is that the people of the Northeast of the region are represented as this Northeast. But what is this Northeast? It is some people's imagination, of how things of how things are, of how the people of the region live. Okay, so I think I don't know whether I've gone more than time permits, but I think those are some of the things that I just wanted to highlight and point out. One is, of course, the colonial representation, and then the second thing is about how in post-colonial India there are, through film and through cinema, the kind of representation that the Northeast gets. So, thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Pachaw, for throwing light on modern traditions of colonial ethnographies, for explaining how homogenization of identities and ethnographic writings of colonial period, post-colonial narratives of history writing, for explaining it to us, and how the otherization seeped into historical traditions, and we need particular narratives more than ever. Thank you so much, ma'am. And now I would request to the next panelist, Mr. Sinha, to share his insights. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jaishree. I had a great time hearing Joy, ma'am, and the insights on the Northeast, because Northeast is an area which has always fascinated me, but unfortunately, that's one area which I have not visited. My greetings to Richa also, who I would look forward to hearing later on. So, in so far as the portrayal of tribals or the subaltern population in our mainstream cinema or books go, in fact, in the last 1 year, there has been a fair amount of representation, or we have come across movies like RRR or Kantara, RRR, which I enjoyed greatly. A typical commercial pot boiler, and Kantara, which was more issue based, which unfortunately I've not managed to see yet. So at least there is a fair amount of interest in our subaltern population lately. My interest in the tribal history or tribal goes back to my childhood. I have grown up in a place called Jamshedpur, which is in Jharkhand. Even though it's an industrial city, an industrial town, it's surrounded by tribal hamlets, tribal villages, and you know, every few kilometers you would find the statue of a tribal icon. Mostly in South Jharkhand, it is of Birsa Munda. So that curiosity or that inquisitiveness to know more about the life of this freedom fighter had always been there. But unfortunately, when we were growing up, history was confined to a certain period, a certain set of invasions, and primary or authenticated sources of information on our subaltern heroes weren't readily available. So while I grew up with that inquisitiveness, at the back of my mind there was always an interest to discover that character in deeper, in more depth, and that opportunity came to me towards while I had been planning to write these books on our tribal warriors for a very long time. That opportunity finally knocked my door or came my way by default when we had this first huge lockdown of 4 to 6 months. That was the time when I decided that it's now or never. So all the articles, a few books which I had gathered, I put them to good use by assembling a certain graph of the story which I would be attempting. Fortunately, there was another writer who was equally interested in the subject, Ankita Verma, who co-authored the book with me. So that is how I got initiated into the subject. But I can tell you, tribal history or subaltern history tends to be far more layered compared to the mainstream history which we have grown up reading or which we normally end up reading. And in fact, one of the things which many people don't know or are not aware of is that our subaltern freedom movement, which I consider today as a parallel freedom movement, far predates the documented or the mainstream freedom movement of which we have read. So while officially we might be given to believe, or we might like to believe, that 1857 was the first real war of independence, tribal mutinies at multiple levels have been active from almost 1870s. In fact, the first major tribal revolution took place around 1783-84 in an area called Bhagalpur in Bihar right now, and was led by a person called Tilka Maji. By the start of the 19th century, you know, while the modes of communication, the modes of commutation were extremely restricted at that point of time, it is quite fascinating that simultaneous movements had begun to take place across the country. So while in the Northeast, in the early 1820s, there was a revolution in the hills of Meghalaya, present-day Meghalaya, led by U. Tirot Singh, across present-day Jharkhand, which was then a part of Bengal, and even the south. There was simultaneous tribal mutinies taking place almost everywhere. And in fact, the 1855 Santhal War, which completes my trilogy on the subject. The first book was on Birsa Munda. The second was an amalgamation or a collection of 17 stories of unknown tribal freedom fighters from across the country. The third one, the 1855 war, the Santhal War, it is known as the Santhal War, was led by the Santhal population, which who exist, in the areas of Bihar. In fact, the present day President Draupadi Murmuji belongs to that Santhal community. Two brothers and along with their family members, it basically engineered or orchestrated that war, and it came to be known as the Hool. The Hool in Santhal language is, it means freedom. So it was a war cry which resulted in uprising in almost all districts all around. So it emanated in the present day Jharkhand in a place called Bhognadi. It went up towards the present day Bihar in the area towards the areas of Bhagalpur, but equally it stretched southeast towards Calcutta, and it went on for almost 6 to 8 months before it was finally combated by the Britishers. Now, the interesting thing about these tribal mutinies or revolutions was that it was far more layered than the mainstream movement. Why? Because in many of the places, the tribals weren't directly fighting the Britishers. The Britishers were well ensconced in the cities and urban places. They were not very comfortable venturing into the hinterlands. So they would essentially outsource their administration to two sources. One was the zamindars, the local landlords, and two, from 1840s onwards, there was a very planned effort at cultural subjugation, and therein the Britishers started planting missionaries. It started with the German missionaries in South Jharkhand, in the present South Jharkhand. But so the missionaries on the one hand, and the zamindars or the local landlords on the other hand, were the two offshoots through which the Britishers would essentially carry out their administration or carry out their misrule. Now, how they were entangled, imagine how they were entangled. Many a times the zamindars would pull the plug with increased taxation. To escape that, the tribal community would run to the missionaries. The missionaries would ask them to convert, um, with the promise that we would get your debts forgiven or debts written off. But at the end of the day, the missionaries themselves were funded by the zamindars. So, they had no real power to get the debts written off. By the time the 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 Adivasi population would realize that it was a trap, often it would lead to immense frustration. Some of them would, succumb or kind of surrender wholeheartedly and give in to the Britishers. In other cases, it would lead to violent revolts, like it happened almost simultaneously or consequentially throughout the 19th century. And obviously, the 1855 Santhal insurrection was later followed by Birsa Munda's revolution in 1899. But the interesting part is that in the 20th century, the tribal freedom movement, which earlier on had virtually assumed the form of guerrilla warfare, evolved with time. So Alluri Sitaram Raju, who essentially was a Kshatriya, but who led a revolution of tribal freedom fighters or tribal warriors of present day Andhra Pradesh. He was essentially a Gandhian for most part of his life. And it was only when he realized that the Gandhian non-violence was not leading him anywhere that in the last 2 years of his life he took to violence. Jaipal Munda, who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, probably the only Adivasi to be a member of the Constituent Assembly, he was one of the most eloquent speakers. And in fact, if you visit his speeches in the Constituent Assembly, they are, in terms of intellect, in terms of gravitas, they are at par with perhaps B.R. Ambedkar. But obviously, he confined himself to Adivasi issues. So he has spoken of the Adivasi idea of democracy, which he believes that the Adivasis always believed in democracy. From they would every house had a different flag, and yet they all respected each other. He has spoken at length on the need to not ban prohibition in Adivasi areas. So the subaltern freedom movement also evolved with time. In Nagaland, in the early part of the 20th century, Rani Gedinliu, who fought cultural subjugation of the Naga population, was one of the most popular freedom fighters. I think going ahead, it is important to understand that these tribal movements, these subaltern movements, in many ways were complementing the mainstream freedom movement, and it's quite unfortunate that they never got documented. Today, when we look back, the sad part is that for most part of our journey as an independent nation in the last 75 years, these tribal leaders or revolutionaries, there was no real attempt to visit their contribution. And I, having worked on Birsa Munda's life extensively, I can tell you that the contribution of most of these freedom fighters were immense. But the reason they were not documented was that during their lifetime, most of them were dismissed as rebels. Most of them were dismissed as essentially rebels, and nobody took them seriously. But Like in the case of Birsa Munda, 8 years after his death, the antagonist against him, he fought his main battle, the last battle. Father Hoffman, a German priest, it was essentially the same Father Hoffman, 8 years after the death of Birsa Munda, who convinced the Britishers that if you want to prevent another revolution of a similar magnitude or scale, you will have to undertake certain reforms. And that eventually led to a landmark Chota Nagpur Land Tenancy Act being passed in 1908, which was essentially for according landholding rights for the tribal population, which was hitherto unheard of. So while Birsa Munda's revolution during his lifetime could not, yield that, he could not get Adivasis those rights. Eventually, the impact of his revolution made the Britishers realize the importance of it. And that, in fact, is the tragedy of most of these subaltern freedom fighters. Most of them died young by the time they were 25 or 30, much like their counterparts in the mainstream freedom movement, which has been documented. In fact, if you look at it, even whether it was Chandrasekhar Azad or Bhagat Singh, all of them died young. They were brave. They took the guns rather than, having a compromised stand on many issues. But I think it's the right time when the nation is kind of waking up to their contribution, and through my three books, the third of Birsa Munda, which is here, the great tribal warriors of Bharat, which followed, and the third one on Sidhu Kano, which will come out. We are racing against time to bring it out on 30th June, which is the commemoration day of the Santhal insurrection, which started in 1855. So with these three books, I mean that's my humble contribution to India's tribal leaders, tribal revolutionaries, and I hope taking a cue from my books. I am not a historian. I call myself a narrative curator. Taking a cue out of my books, I hope that in the years to come there will be serious research and more historians will be drawn to the subject, and there will be more depiction of it both in literature and in mainstream cinema in India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for shedding light on the layered histories of tribal struggles and Indian freedom movement, for factual and narrative informations. And we wish you luck for your new book, sir.
Thank
Now
you.
I'll move on to the next and last speaker. I would now request Ms. Richa Lakhera to share her insights. Ma'am, over to you. Richa, ma'am, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you, but I
Yeah.
think your video. Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you. Yes.
All right, fine, wonderful. So it was lovely listening to Tuhin and Joy before that. And I totally agree with what she was saying. You know, most Indian storytelling in mainstream, its approach is mostly casteism, is basically flawed and insensitive. You know, in a very strange way, what we see is Browning. When we talk about Browning in Hollywood, is just trying to, just if we try to compare the two things, a very ironical way. It's the way Indians are stereotyped in Hollywood films with weird accents, and you have Appu, who's always shown as being very dark, eating curry, all are engineers. Appu's portrayal was accused at the time as being, very racist caricature of Indians, and it was criticized in the because of the bias, obviously because it was shown along racial and ethnic lines, and there was this whole brown voice similar to the blackface thing, and all the while. And there was a huge hue and cry, but all the while in India itself, we have entire communities who are stereotyped and storytelling. Because I come from the fiction segment, and I'm not a historian; I'm a fiction writer, and my book, Contamination, my heroine happens to be a tribal combat heroine. I'll come to that. But so basically what I've seen is that, you know, the entire storytelling, especially when it comes to fiction, so there's this whole broad stroking of a whole people, a whole culture in one sentence, like a backward region or conflict ridden zone. You know, when I wrote Contamination, taking the conversation forward or ahead, yeah, I mean, this wasn't in my mind. I was just writing a story, and this was the journey of my hero, who happens to be a tribal woman combat, a tribal warrior, and who has everything stacked against her. I'll talk about her later on. And the double whammy is that not only she faces the trials of operating in a male-dominated zone, but she's also treated horribly by the other communities. And so while you know, writing the story, of course there were no questions. That's a solitary process or story you want to really, you know, invest in. But while pitching the book, people had lots of questions that why do you want to write, why did you write about a character from, you know, you don't belong to the community, how, why did you choose this particular topic, why did you not write on, you know, journalism, the film industry, why not crime thriller, because I'm a crime writer. So all kinds of questions. But thankfully films like Kantara, RRR, Bahubali, Tumbar, you know, they had already introduced a vocabulary in storytelling, so it was not entirely out of the blue. But coming to the gist of your question, you know, just 2 days ago, I had a session with the very young writer and Dalit activist, Sumit Semos. And Sumit is all things wonderful. You know, he sensitizes people about struggles and frustrations and outlook of the marginalized community with his rap music. And he hip hops against caste discrimination. His rap, अगर आप भी सुनिए उसे कभी, it's very powerful. He doesn't mince words. And it's very popular amongst the young Adivasi tribals and Dalit community. You know, lyrics like "तू कहता है मेरा भारत महान," and he's, you know, he's a young boy. These are the youth of today. So we are talking about people of today. You know, the youth of today who actually listen to him, and he has lyrics like "तू कहता है मेरा भारत महान, मैं हूँ कहाँ, मेरा क्या." You know, so songs like "मर के भी जीना है, अब लड़ाई सीख ले," "जाती है कि जाती ही नहीं." So these are his book. I had gone through his book, and I had a panel discussion with him about his book, which talked about the, you know, the struggles of the marginalized communities, of the tribals and Adivasis and Dalits, and he comes from this, you know, it is his actual lived experience from the subaltern Christian tradition in South Orissa, and it's very a hugely layered existence. Of course, there are other issues. Because generally, when we look at the subaltern traditions, we think of tribal mutinies, we think of other movements. But you know, he talks about the contemporary youth. He talks about the yearnings of today's issues. And it's not like some hot take on social media where issues are produced for consumption for the middle class youth, you know, who are always looking for some social cause to be stirred by. The context is real. His lyrics imply that true freedom for the Dalit, for the Adivasi, for the marginalized, and for context, we are celebrating the 75 years of independence next year. And he says that it's still a distant dream for the community, and celebration they feel is pointless. Coming to, you know, the other part is, you know, immediate impetus for me as a journalist, as a writer, and I cover the entertainment beat. But you know, there were several, what should I say? I mean, you can't pinpoint one thing, because one is subjected to images of stories and conflicts all the time. It triggers a kind of a cognitive dissonance on narratives, because whether it is cinema, art, books, all these are very powerful, and music, very powerful tools, you know, somehow. But the storytelling, especially when it comes to the storytelling of the backward region, it all comes down to one single, basically one, it's a conflict-ridden zone. It's very reductive. Like for instance, let's talk of South Orissa. I had no idea about this. You know, South Orissa has 4 regions. It's a very bauxite-rich area. Just like in gangs of Wasipur, what iron, you know, mines are to Dhanbad, bauxite is to that area. And different families there of tribal, the people who are staying there, you know, the communities who are staying there, they have different experiences. Some want to move out of the city. They want to leave the land wars behind. Some want to stay back and work in the mines. Some think that, you know, fighting the land wars is futile. They want education, jobs for their children. Some are intellectually stagnated. Some work for NALCO, and there is, of course, the CRPF presence there. Some support the Maoists. Some have very strange stories I heard about, you know, there are people who react to some Maoist leaders who, you know, and they react very differently when they see that their children are studying in colleges and have big houses. So वो सब भी बदलता है. So I heard Sumit songs and rap and उसे बहुत खूब बयान किया उन सब में. And but what we see in storytelling, especially, it never really does justice to that. I mean, you're just broad stroking. No one is really talking about the Adivasis demanding separate religion column in census, or because these issues don't have any political aesthetics. They are not glamorous. No one wants to talk about that. It's like always traveling in and contested territory for members of the community and every minute of their lives. And we don't see that really represented in mainstream content which we see on OTT or in the films. It is a very romantic version which we see. My point is that they need what is actually needed is what as when I was talking to Sumit, and what he was really saying really that touches upon what is really needed is a kind of they need to be released from the social terror, which is not the paranoia of their own mind. It is there and it's very real. It's visible on the face of every boss, every person when they actually come out of that area and work in corporates, when they work in institutions, in whether it's bureaucracy, whether it's academics, whether in so where they cannot hope to find any representation. They want seat at the table. So these are the things which actually really matter for the marginalized communities, And the thing is, they won't know what every, so to speak, prominent or dominant caste community or upper caste in the country feels. They can only conclude, from the state of their institutions. They don't know if the member of the upper caste or from the dominant caste hates them, wants them, not wants them, but they do know that their places of worship, entering them may get them killed, right? Whether it's newsrooms or unions or lobbies or academia or bureaucracy or even board of education, so they are not at the table, so they don't know. So we want them to risk it all and their way of life and on an act of faith, and that India is that land of idealism which they have really never seen. So it's a big leap of faith for them, and this is what was really brought out in his songs also. And coming back to my work, this is essentially, as I said, as a journalist, generally one's exposed to a lot of conflict stories, and specifically related to this book, Contamination. This is based on the land wars between the state and indigenous tribes and forest dwellers, and who thrive along the belt in northeast. And of course, this one is around Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and Orissa, of course, to name a few. But we can, of course, later on, maybe we'll talk a little more about the book. But, or do I have time? Can I maybe, do I have time to talk a little bit about the book? Hi, Jaishree, do I have time? Can I talk about the book right now?
You may finish it first. Or ma'am, we'll later take questions as well regarding the book as well. You can finish that later as well. Hello.
All right,
Hello,
fine.
ma'am. Yeah.
So can I start talk? Can I just give a little bit just because it really makes sense, it really connects to this. So can I give a little bit of gist about my book here?
Please, ma'am. Yes, please do that.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that, so these people, so she belongs to a tribe and they are they're basically buried under compromise, exploited, stigmatized, marginalized. They're viewed with suspicion. They are not allowed to enter the mainstream. But the real conflict arises when they are denied the one thing they own, which is their traditional land rights and right over their own land parcel. And sometimes, of course, and here in how it works is they resist, they take up arms, they fight back, and that kind of earns them the wrath of the state. And the state is very powerful. It has endless supplies, and as we all know, I mean, states are built to outflank every outburst of rebellion. And we all know how effectively, whether it is economic blockade or whether it is police bandobast or nakabandi, all kinds of tools can be employed to suppress, this kind of a rebellion. So stakes become very high, and this is a fiction book. So contamination. So it becomes. So of course, you have to introduce elements of, which make it a little more interesting to the reader. And so in the book, you have the contamination on one side, and you have the bullets flying and grenades exploding and the body count rising, and my characters are dodging artillery, getting slammed and everything. And the other side, they are kind of, I've introduced the supernatural element or horror imagery in the book because I wanted to see, how much of you try to merge the paranoia of a constant war with the horror imagery, so to speak. And so basically, of course, the larger unifying theme of the book is that war is the greater horror. War is the greater horror and not ghosts or ghouls. Was I skeptical about having a tribal heroine as my female combat lead? Actually, not in the beginning, but somewhere when I started, talking to people, when I started pitching my book, that time a bit of, this thing happened because people were, okay, why isn't your heroine from the, the northern belt, or why isn't she from the mainstream? So that is the first time I said, but why is that even a question? Was I skeptical about introducing fantastic to rational? Yes, that was of course a big issue. But at the end of the day, one has to go with the gut feeling. Another thing here was that the tribal woman combat leading a group of male combats. Of course, they are also tribals. So our hero goes through the double trials of operating in a male-dominated zone. So if she had refused that challenge, then her experience would have been of a victim, and then it goes on about, the plot kind of provokes her to make her choices. It's entirely fictional, it's not based on anyone, and her choices reveal her integrity. So this is essentially what the book is about. It is about a tribal combat heroine and it's her journey, the story of becoming a hero. So you don't have a stereotypical Adivasi tribal heroine who is waiting for some, member from the dominant caste or from the upper caste male, urban male, coming to rescue her. It's not happening. This is not happening in this. This is not that book. So, because traditionally the urban, when you say traditionally the storytelling template always has, generally we see that the urban male hero template, the Adivasi woman, if she's there, is either the temptress to tempt the male away from his goal, or she's a catalyst to help him achieve his goal. But this is not that woman. So this is a breakaway from the typical representation of the Adivasi tribal hero, so to speak. And she's not waiting for any upper caste male from the city, like we have seen in several Hindi films, of yore, and they have been guilty of portraying that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this thought-provoking discussion and on storytelling, mediums, and politics around it, and nitty-gritties of fictional writing and around tribal characters, especially. Now we will move on to the question-answer session part of the session. Sir, can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Yes.
Yeah, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay. My first question, I'll quickly ask. My first question to Professor Pachuau is, ma'am, history and academia seems to have failed to configure the historical trajectories of northeastern areas and tribal communities of the region appropriately from pre and post colonial times. Your comment on this, ma'am, please.
Well, I guess you mean the colonial period and the post-colonial period, because in the pre-colonial period, especially in the tribal areas, as you know, literacy was something that came in only with colonialism. So I think what you mean is colonial period and in the post-colonial period. In the colonial period, like I have already mentioned, I think there have been several works that have come out from the region, especially from anthropologists and colonial ethnographers and things like that. So the region has been whatever may be the faults with their writing, there are lots of problems with the kind of works that they produce, no doubt. But definitely, the sort of bringing out of the region for a wider audience came with the arrival of colonialism into the region. Okay, so in the post-colonial period, I guess at one level. Why isn't the history of a particular region not written, or a particular community not written? There are many reasons for that. But for instance, I think in the immediate post-colonial period, the region has had a lot of insurgency, for instance, at one level. So that has prevented the writing the writing of the histories of the region from people from outside the region. Okay, so that could be given as one of the reasons, but I think also it is a general apathy, and as a journalist once said, the region is on the map but off the mind. So, in a certain sense, people have a vague understanding. People had, let's put it this way. I think in more recent times, people are much more aware of the Northeast. But in the years after independence, I guess with a lot of things happening in this part of the subcontinent, the region was sort of neglected, and the region is somewhere out there, but it's not in the minds of people. So I guess in some senses, the region has not been presented, or the history of the region has not been presented because of those kinds of reasons. One is, of course, as I said, the post-colonial period has been a very insurgency, you know, you know, how's the word? It has had a lot of conflict at one level, and so that has prevented a lot of academic work from taking place. And in more recent times, there are so many good works that are coming out from the region, especially in more recent times, the past 5-10 years. You find that there's a lot of academic work ever since the region has opened up and access is much more easily available. And so I think definitely, I think there will be more work to come in the near future as well.
Thank you for clearing this up for us, ma'am. Sir, my question to Tuhin sir is, sir, the first question is, in the context of your book, The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, what are the primary reasons behind neglecting the tribal heroes from historical documentation of Indian struggles for independence? After so many years of following a particular narrative in school, colleges, and beyond, don't you think that a natural mind block resists their due recognition even now?
Well, there are two reasons. So one is that post-independence, our history books or our history syllabuses basically continue to be what they were prior to independence. We never really made a concerted effort to revisit the syllabus, and that was largely because of a colonial mindset which prevailed for many more years beyond independence. The second reason was that subaltern history or tribal history is never easy to document because, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, till the time these freedom fighters or these revolutionaries were alive, nobody kind of felt it necessary to document their journeys. They were essentially dismissed as small-time rebels, and most of them, died young. The average age of most of them would be less than 30 years. It was only after their death, many years after the death, that people would suddenly wake up and realize, because of a existing implication that may have taken place in the community, when they would revisit the community's journey in hindsight, they would discover the contribution of these freedom fighters. And when you don't have first-hand authenticated sources of information, revisiting a movement in hindsight is never easy. So I think these are the two reasons essentially because of which the portrayal and depiction of tribal heroes have been extremely limited or basically non-existent in our history books.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. My next question is to Richa, ma'am. Ma'am, your just released book, Contamination, you were talking
Yeah, but
about it.
Jaishree, I've already answered that question. I combined it with the first one. So now you ask me the second one.
Okay, can I ask you the second one? All right, ma'am. All
Absolutely,
right.
go ahead.
Okay. Ma'am, the indigenous community has faced years of humiliation on the basis of their looks, practices, etc. Sometimes general caste don't even realize that they are making offensive statements. Many scholars have shared their lived experience under our current project on tribal history as well. Does that make it challenging for well-intended authors like you? Did you feel the pressure to be politically correct and careful about the words used for tribal representation in mainstream fiction?
Yes, I mean, stereotyping for me, it's all forms of storytelling, and sadly, this is seen maximum when it comes to storytelling, which deals with the tribals or the marginalized caste. It's extremely flawed and insensitive. It really doesn't make, my problem is it doesn't make other communities uncomfortable enough or make them reflect on their own privileges and surroundings. So it doesn't address the elephant in the room. And basically, the way things are shown is from the upper caste gaze, in the sense the way they like to see things. Like, give you an example. Netflix may, I don't know whether you've seen something called Class. It is branding itself. It is a Netflix. It's a series where students from different communities are in a posh school, and three tribal students manage to get admission in that school and how they are treated. And this series is branding itself as a social commentary on oppressive regimes. My point is that characters are at ease and rather dismissive while making casteist remarks. They just make a remark and they move on to the next conversation. It is making it very easier for the viewer to ignore the implication of that rampant prejudice. It's like you can make that remark and you can just move on. That's what's happening, and that's what's showing. So most on-screen portrayals of this kind of marginalization normalizes the casteist language and lets the characters off the hook without dealing with any consequences. मतलब mental impact से deal करना तो बहुत दूर की बात है. The question is that what message is conveyed even to the upper caste or the prominent or the predominant caste individual while he is watching such a show and a film, that he can get away by making such remarks, that it can be taken lightly, that there won't be any consequences, because we are not seeing that on the content. So creators are using very rustic, crude language when it comes to members of the marginalized community. आप उसके aesthetics देख लीजिए, suddenly gloomy हो जाता है सब कुछ. Whenever it is a tribal or a Dalit student, his life, suddenly the colors change, it becomes gloomy. While it's all swanky and bright and beautifully lit when it is for a member of the dominant caste. So casting directors, especially, and I'm talking obviously since I'm a fiction writer and I come from that segment. I'm not a historian. I'll just repeat that again. And what we see is that casting directors, when it comes to representing oppressed castes, darken the faces of the actors, right? And this is called appearance politics. And in mainstream content is more about how the upper caste wants to see them. They want to see them as shabby, ragged, dark-skinned, covered in soil. The question is, why do they not want them to come out of that appearance politics? It's like they want to confine them in that zone. Is my problem. Moreover, the economic condition of such characters is always dire. Audience can feel bad for the character. If a person is watching something like this, please try and watch Class, and you audience may feel bad for such characters, and they will have these intellectual discussions, conversations in their groups. But then after that, nothing going to happen. I mean, there'll be, because obviously there are no consequences, right? So what I'm saying is that cinema, art, books, music, they are very powerful tools. The biggest challenge, but they can be easily misused to make this kind of a thing, is like, in the sense, seem as if it has just acceptable. And to make inequality seem very noble, to normalize a kind of a dominant caste, masculinity, and also simplifying the problem. I'll give you an example. You must have seen the film Jai Bhim, which came in 2021. It garnered Everyone must have seen it, and it garnered a lot of tremendous support from the masses, and for treating a very sensitive subject with very contemporary sensibility. तो उसमें एक scene है, आपका lead character है, last scene है, this is the last scene of Jai Bhim. The lead character is reading a newspaper with his legs on the table, right, in the last scene. So a young girl comes in, she's from the marginalized community and Adivasi, and she comes and she imitates him. The camera focuses on Baba Saheb Ambedkar's frame on the wall, and insinuation ये है कि education can fight all social upheaval, which is right. But many activists are not really convinced that the film actually did justice to the real issues, and that it is trivializing and simplifying the whole war as because it's just a fragment of the larger fight. You see, so in Indian films, another thing we've seen is that tribal characters are generally foot soldiers, right? And in a sense, when is the last time you've seen them doing real justice to the real issues? They're generally in films you will see them either with black face. अच्छा अगर आपको याद है पुरानी फिल्में भी होती थी जो either they'll be wearing shells and beads and half dressed, half naked people, singing. If you remember. Even from Satyajit Ray's film, Aranyar Din Ratri thi shayad wo, and to Rajamouli's RRR, Madhumati, Nagin, Talash, Mani Ratnam's Ravan, Manna Days ka Lata Mangeshkar mein immortalized एक song था, चढ़ गया पापी बिछुआ. Then हम बेवफा में अगर आप गाना सुने, किशोर कुमार in the 1978 film Shalimar, वो ट्राइबल कम्युनिटी है, लेकिन वर्ड्स क्या आ रहे हैं? झिंगा लाला हूँ. I mean, उसका मतलब क्या है? What is the meaning of that? So, it holds no resonance to any native language. झिंगा लाला हूँ is not in any native language of any tribal community, but films, have used all kinds of depictions to show or to keep the tribals in their place, because it's so. And despite the evolution of Indian cinema, the one thing that remains unchanged actually is still the stereotypical. And I remember, I think Joy also mentioned this, how stereotypical presentation of Adivasi community, even in the films which came recently, like Chak De India in 2007, उसमें portray किया है आदिवासी hockey player from Jharkhand, वो primitive दिखाया उसे, ठीक है. And you have your Three Idiots. Three Idiots में it glossed over the tribal identity of Kunsu Pandu. Mary Com seemed very uninterested in talking about the tribal roots of the champion boxer. Mani Ratnam की रावण में वीरा जो आपको मुंडा है उसमें जूनियर बच्चन जो हैं वो बहुत violent, he's a violent lawbreaker. So Rajamouli's Bahubali presented Kalkeya tribe, again the tribals as violent and brutal people. So Indian cinema basically the problem is still doesn't know Indian storytelling, still doesn't know what to do with the tribal character, how to show the tribal character. And also the producers are also unsure, about the audience's commitment to the tribal stories. And I guess that मेरे को first hand when I was pitching my book. And this is the first reaction most of the production houses also had, that, I mean, will people be interested in watching this? आपका जो your main character, she is a tribal heroine. You see, so producers, they have to put in money and they're unsure whether the audience are committed to tribal stories. And will the audience be willing to see a tribal in the lead role? So Indian films fail to go beyond the usual tropes. They're very cliche-ridden, yes. Indigenous communities of India are still shown as, used as fillers or as tokens of inclusivity. And tribals are still boxed into very misguided stereotypes. They are portrayed as barbaric and people who wouldn't blink twice before killing someone, raising conformity with the upper caste, urban-centered imagination of what an Adivasi is like. You see, so generally we hence end up watching Adivasi still as savage, brutish, and very naive people who live in the herds, like we saw in the hugely popular RRR. So I am sorry to say, but the gaze is still very predominant, especially when it comes to mainstream content, about which I'm supposed to talk about, and especially when it comes to mainstream content, the gaze is still predominantly upper caste through his lens, upper caste and urban folk. It's through his gaze.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this very elaborated answer and very well said about the gaze still is there. My next question to Professor Joy, ma'am, from the Mizo Hills to tribal district of Lohasi Hills to present Mizoram, how are the indigenous inhabitants of the land represented in contemporary historiographies? Do they get a fair deal in their representation? Your take on that.
Okay, I'll be very brief because I sort of answered the question earlier as well. You know, when the people of the region, when any of the communities of the Northeast are spoken about, it's especially the history of the region. It usually is in the nature of generalities. Okay, so very little work actually has come out uh, 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 on the region per se. But like I said earlier, a lot of local tribals and local people from the region are writing histories of the region. So I think the histories of the region are being written by the people themselves. And when the local people write it themselves, there's a distinct difference between the way it is written, between the kind of issues that are written about, because the audience generally is the people themselves. And I think Richa has also been talking about it, about how tribals are represented in films. It is a representation by the other. However, when locals themselves talk about themselves, the concerns are very different, and the way this historiography shifts is also quite interesting. So, like I said earlier, in the case of Mizoram, there were historians from the region writing about themselves, and for them, for instance, the origins play a very important part in the narrative. How did they come about? What are the stories about where they migrated from, how they came? So those are the kinds of stories that are interest. In more recent times, trying to remember the years of the insurgency, or the fight for independence from the 60s to the 80s, and the memory surrounding that becomes very important for the people of Mizoram. So there's a lot of more interesting work that is coming about with art, because of the accord that was signed in 86, which makes it about 30-40 years since the signing of the accord. Uh, so the memory of that period of insurgency is something that is being taken into consideration as well. And in more recent times, there is a movement towards a greater Mizo identity, or greater Mizoram. And so people are looking into the histories of that as well. So I think the point that I want to stress here is that when the people of the region write their own histories, their concerns are very different from the kind of historiography that comes from outside the region as well. So, and I think this is true for various communities in the Northeast. I gave you the example of the Mizos, but I think what we need more in more in greater quantity is the writing that comes out from the region by the people themselves. And I think a lot of work needs to be done in that regard, because then the focus is changed. There's not so much an attempt at valorizing, but it's just that the issues that concern the people are very different from how they seek to be, how they are represented from the outside. So I think that's I will answer that question briefly in that manner.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, we need more voices from within the region. Sir, my next question again, sir. Sir, we know little or nothing did in the Indian freedom movement, various direct, indirect capacities. Please shed light on this overlooked aspect from the history of India, which would be inspiring for the community and also a pride for the country.
Your voice is cracking. Your voice was cracking.
Sir, can you see
Yeah, yeah.
the question?
Yeah. So in fact, like I said, since there is not much authenticated information available on tribal history, it's all the more difficult to find first-hand information and authenticated information about women in tribal history. Nonetheless, there are a few women. For example, tribal communities span across the country, right from the northeastern tribes to the Gond community in Gond and the Bhil community in the central parts of the country, to the Munda and the Orao and Santhal communities in Bihar, Jharkhand, and Orissa. So, in fact, right through the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, in fact, the Gond community was ruling many parts of central India. So, if you look at it, Rani Durgavati was, many of the cities in present day Madhya Pradesh are associated with the tribal queens. For example, if you look at Jabalpur has a historical tryst with Rani Durgavati, who was essentially a Gond queen. Gond is one of the dominant tribal communities in central India. Bhopal has a tryst with Rani Kamlapati. Rani Kamlapati essentially was the wife of the Gond ruler in the early part of the 18th century, but then her husband was killed by one of his cousins, and she invited one of the invading mercenaries to help her restore their rule over the kingdom. So she was installed briefly as the queen of Bhopal until she realized that the mercenary who she had hired to uproot the family member who had killed her husband was actually had other machinations up his sleeve. So if you look at it, Rani Durgavati, Rani Kamlapati are very good examples of tribal queens who have, but again, not much information. We still need more literature around them. When it comes to a freedom struggle, through my book, The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, we tried to bring out the stories of 4 women tribal freedom fighters, and all of them, in fact, were from the northeast. So Rani Gaidinliu was one of them. Helen Lepcha was one of them. And in my latest book, Siddho Kano, again, the sisters of Siddho Kano had a very important supportive role to play throughout the 1855 Santhal insurrection. So these are some of the examples, but I do believe that a lot more research, a lot more institutionalized research needs to go into the stories of our tribal women fighters and rulers.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for answering the question. As we are already exceeding the time limit, if I have your permission, we can go another round of questions, or we can wrap this up right here, sir, ma'am. Whatever you say. Should we go another round of questions, ma'am, sir, or should we wrap this up?
Maybe I can just one last bit. Maybe I can just add one last bit here. And that's, I think, then we can wrap up because it's already 8. Yeah.
It's already 8 now, right? That's what I
8:23 actually. So maybe we can just I'll just add a few things and maybe we can just wrap up. Can I just add a few things? Yeah.
Of course, ma'am. Of course, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Right. So I was listening to Joy, and she's just bang on. So there's this saying, someone was saying it in a jungle, until one tells a story from the deer's point of view, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So locals documenting their own stories is the most important thing. That, and this is what I really admired when I was talking to Sumit. the kind of lyrics, and I've become a huge fan. You must listen to his songs, and that really tells you there's so much more to the Adivasi life than land conflicts. They have so many stories happening there. And can I just say here that the upsurge of this anti caste and marginalized tribe cinema has happened with filmmakers like, and it's happening with filmmakers like Neeraj Gaiwan hai, Nagraj Manjule is there, P.A. Ranjit is there, but still, as Joy was saying, there's still not enough storytelling that's coming from the members of the community. Stuff which is documented by historians who are patronized by regimes is the only thing we have mostly, and then it will be used to present the urban way of life as the savior, and not Dalit and not marginalized community mobilization. You see, so basically, otherwise, if you see, look at the mainstream content generally. I mean, you'll never see, or you'll never see topics like refer to the violence or the denial of land rights or the disproportionate presence of the dominant caste in judiciary, media, academy, or bureaucracy. These things just don't happen. Another thing I want to really talk about just struck me that a couple of in fact last year we had the Black Lives Matter had swept across the world and across India. And someone just brought up this point in the last session I had, that we never have the biggest of names in India who ever talking about, the marginalized castes in India, or the caste or injustice in India, or the tribal communities, or how they are represented or not represented, and they also face similar violence. So that is one thing which we have never really seen happening in India. We don't have the biggest names or the so-called celebrities, really talking about that, about these issues, and they are facing the similar kind of violence. For instance, I think it was just a couple of weeks back when when Darshan Solanki had committed suicide in Bombay IIT, and that was, of course, due to his the way he was being targeted because of his, and of course, what. There's a lot of ambiguity surrounding Darshan's death. In an interview to the TV channels, his sister said that his friends had stopped speaking to him once they got to know that he's from a different community, a marginalized community, but the authorities have denied. The main concern is still not addressed, that there is minimal and no Adivasi or Dalit representation, or low caste representation, or marginalized caste representation in the faculty or in the administration. And that is a problem, and that is still not addressed. And apart from that, coming back to just one last point here, because I heard Tuhin talk about some of the female women tribal representations. There's a lot of stereotyping happening there too when it comes to how women are represented in especially mainstream content, because the gaze again is upper class urban male. So women tribal characters are often trapped in very sexualized portrayals. Filmmakers love to show nomadic or Banjaran appearances of female actors. Either they'll be wearing multicolored blouses, or maybe plunging necklines. There'll be a lot of skin show. This always happens if you watch the films of yore, and they perform to tunes of sometimes gibberish or mainstream music, and even the songs and lyrics basically stray away from their actual language, right? Whether it was, I think I just mentioned before this, there was Karma, where Asha Parekh's character, and she's shown as a Adivasi woman, but she's shown as a clown, right? And there is no point. And there is a tribal chief in the film, and his name is not even revealed all through the film, because no one is, it's literally, apart from sexualizing the characters, it's literally the kind of the way they are represented borders on the offensive, the kind of misrepresentation and ignorance we see. So, and for the longest time, a cinematic marker of the tribal woman, especially the woman, was no blouses, right? Or our stories have that toxic record of catering to the urban predominant caste binary, and that's a fact. And we, of course, need to change. But this is not really a new thing. Even in the great Satyajit Ray, in his film, when he represented the tribal communities in his film, as I said, Simi Garewal. So the whole sexual gaze towards the Adivasi woman, That's a story. I don't know whether you've seen that film. It's about a tribe near Jharkhand, and one of the characters is attracted to the local Santhal woman, Duli, who's Simi Garewal. But instead of going through the civil route of wooing the girl, as he would have done with a city girl, because she's an Adivasi girl, he pulls her into the forest to have sex with her. So since Duli is an Adivasi woman, she shows no resistance, and this is how women are shown in mainstream content, and that has been happening for the longest time. And no one is paying any heed to the socio-economic marginalization of Adivasis by the state capital nexus. It does not, the content does not delve into the uncontrollable capitalist thrust for development at the cost of native and rightful owners of the places. That's not happening, because what is happening is that Adivasis have been branded as uncivilized, and the characters who come from the cities, or and the urban upper caste male has to be the savior. And until that doesn't change, this whole ecosystem, until that doesn't change, we're going to see more of such films even in the future.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for these last very thoughtful remarks and beautifully concluding it. We have this brings us to the end of today's session. I thank all the panelists once again for sharing invaluable perspectives on this topic. I apologize, we have already exceeded the time limit, and this also reminds me that we are called reminds. This is also to remind that we are calling for the submission on tribal history and tribal representation in history, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. We will come back to you soon with other next panel discussions on the project. Till then, good night, everyone. Thank you, Professor Joy. Thank you, Tuhin sir. Thank you, Richa ma'am.
Thank you.
This has been lovely. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, guys.